Okay. Why you look like you're playing Fortnite? Why are you standing up? Sometimes we want to perform some sort of calculation or computation in our function. So the answer to this calculation can be stored in a local variable. Well, will be stored in a local variable. However, we might want to use that answer outside of our function. So remember I said if we created a variable within our function, it's going to be stored as a local variable and it can't be used anywhere else. So let's say we created a variable x, we created a variable y, then within our function, we created a variable z and said z is equal to x plus y. And we may want to use z somewhere else in our function. We can't do that if we don't use something called our return function. So, however, we might want to use that answer outside of our function in the rest of the program, but since the variable is local, we can't. Okay. To be able to use the answer outside of the function, we use something called a return function or value. So let's look at example 1. Remember our very first question, we're asking our user for the weight in kilograms, ask the user for the height in meters, both stored as a float, and then we're going to say BMI equals weight divided by height squared. And then we're printing out your BMI is whatever to 2 decimal places. Here we are calculating a person's BMI. If this is part of a larger program where we must calculate BMI several times, we may want to use a function instead of repeating the formula. So let's look at our function now. So we could create a function. We define a function, say calculate BMI. We pass 2 parameters for height and weight. And then we say BMI equals weight divided by height squared. And print your BMI is whatever after we calculate it. But remember what I said. We can't use this BMI. We won't be able to say, let's say outside of this function we said print BMI. We won't be able to do that because BMI is a local variable and we'll get a syntax error. So maybe what we'd have to do, we'd have to use a return function which would allow us to save that BMI as a global variable. So here we have a function which calculates the BMI using the parameters weight and height, then prints it out. In the program, you get the user's weight and height, then call the function to calculate and print the BMI. The problem is that if we don't want to print the BMI, and instead we want to use it somewhere else in the program, we can't use this function. Here later on in the program, we're creating a variable for weight. We're asking the user to enter their weight. We're creating a variable for height and asking the user to enter the height. And then we're passing our weight value into our parameter and our height value that the user entered into our parameter. So now let's see how we're going to use the return value. Okay, so using our return value, which allows us to save this BMI variable as a global variable, and we could use it anywhere in our program. We're going to define our function, calculate BMI, pass out 2 parameters as we did, weight and height. Say BMI equals weight divided by height squared. And then instead of printing out this BMI, we're going to return this value. This return BMI value will allow us to save it as a global variable. So let's continue with our program. We're going to ask the user to enter their weight, ask the user to enter their height, and what I want you to realize, what we're going to do is, we're going to create another variable, but as a global variable. We're going to say BMI equals, and we're going to make this BMI equal to our function. So our function is calculate BMI with weight and height passed as our parameters. And then we'll be able to print out your BMI is, and print out our BMI as, Bevan? Want me to repeat?
Yes, from the
Okay, so let's say we didn't have this line, and then I wanted to print out my BMI. I will get an error. Everybody agrees that I will get an error.
Yeah.
I'll get an error because BMI is now a local variable, and we'll be looking somewhere in our program for a global variable, and we won't find it. But with this return BMI function, we have now saved the answer of this as a global variable. Now, to be able to use this, we have to do one more step. We have to create a variable. What I do was use the same variable name, and I said BMI equals, and I made it equal to my function. So my BMI is equal to this function, which returns this BMI value. So it's equal to calculate BMI, and we pass two parameters of weight and height. And then now I'm able to print out this function because I'll be able to find my BMI variable. So this is looking for a global BMI variable, and that's what I have right here. So we're going to try.
So the return making it a global variable.
Yes. So I'm going to go along with you, and I'm going to try modify the previous question so that, okay, let's go to. Okay, so think of ways to modify the number of programs using modify question from the function. Determine which of these values could be modified to use return values and do the modifications. Okay. Let's think of, so we did a couple problems before. We did our grid user, we did our even numbers function, we did our sum of range function. We haven't done our list insertion.
We skip number 5.
Yeah, that and we went to 5. So I want us to think for a while, and which of these functions do you think we could use our return function? Remember, with our return function, we're trying to return maybe a calculation or one of our variables so that we could use later on in our program. Question 3.
Yeah.
So question 3, we are calculating a value of total. We're adding all our values together and we're creating a total. So maybe we don't want to print out our value of total immediately. Maybe we want to return that value of total and use it somewhere else. Maybe say total plus 50 somewhere else in our program. So what I want you to do is rewrite this program, change it slightly. So instead of printing out total, I want you to return your value of total. And then I want you to create a global variable called total and make it equal to your function.